Welcome back. I'm Muggsy, and today I'm going to explain Gymnosperms. As you can see, I'm standing in a forest surrounded by conifers. I've got a western red cedar right here, Douglas fir behind me, and in fact all around me. This is pretty typical of the Pacific Northwest. These conifer trees are gymnosperms, and gymnosperms are the next step in plant evolution after our ferns and horsetails, our pteridophytes. They evolved about 380 million years ago, before the dinosaurs, and in fact were really dominant in the ecosystem of the dinosaurs, particularly the Triassic and the Jurassic. Besides conifers, gymnosperms also include cycads. It includes Ginkgo biloba, just a single species for that one, and then also our Gnetophytes, which are really weird plants that we'll talk about in this video. Despite being hundreds of millions of years old, gymnosperms still thrive today, particularly in some of the more extreme environments on Earth. Northern latitudes where it's cold with short summers, mountains which are even more extreme, and in fact some of the harshest deserts on Earth. So these are plants that are really made to withstand the test of time and take a beating. Besides that, if you were to think of the tallest plant, the biggest plant by volume, and the oldest plant, you'd actually be thinking of gymnosperms. 3 different species, all here in North America, in fact, all in my home state of California. The tallest plant on Earth, as far as we know, is a coastal redwood. The biggest plant on Earth is a sequoia, a giant sequoia tree. And then the longest lived plant on Earth, also in California, is a bristlecone pine, a really gnarled looking conifer that has survived a really long time, eking out a harsh existence in the extreme high altitudes. With all that being said, let's get into gymnosperms. We'll talk about the main groups of gymnosperms, then we'll talk about how they evolved and what's been happening with their evolutionary history, and then finally we'll talk about their life cycle with respect to the alternation of generations that we see in all plants. So come along, let's check it out. So what is a gymnosperm anyway? Well, if we look at the word gymnosperm, it's made of 2 Greek roots, gymno and sperm. Gymno means naked. Like the ancient Greeks used to do gymnastics in the nude because they didn't want to get their toga all dirty. The place they would do this is the gymnasium, where people would hang out naked, although don't do it today because you'll get in trouble and it's just kind of gross and weird. Sperm, on the other hand, means seed. So when you put those 2 together, gymnosperm, we're talking about plants that produce seeds but don't encase those seeds in a fruit. Those plants we call angiosperms. Angiosperms are flowering plants that produce flowers and produce fruit to contain the seed. Angio means vessel, and sperm again means seed for obvious reasons. So angiosperms are plants that keep their seeds in a vessel, and we call that vessel the fruit. So if we look at our vascular plants, our plants that have vascular tissue and can grow tall, we have ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. If we look at just the plants that produce seeds, we have gymnosperms and angiosperms. The vast majority of these plants that produce seeds are angiosperms, because it turns out flowers and fruit are really good evolutionary devices for pollination, for reproduction, for spreading your genes. And angiosperms largely have been able to outcompete gymnosperms. Today, gymnosperms only account for about 0.25% of all plant species, where angiosperms it's upwards of 90%. These are plants, these gymnosperms, that have done well in the past during the time of the dinosaurs, but have since been outcompeted by these angiosperms and now represent a relatively small number of species. Gymnosperms are some of the earliest plants to have pollen, and pollen is an absolute game changer for terrestrial, on land reproduction, because you don't have to have your sperm swim through water to the egg, like happens with ferns and bryophytes, and algae for that matter. Instead, you can encase your sperm in this special survival kit, survival pod for sperm called pollen, and blow it in the wind to a plant where it's going to be, where it's going to find an egg and reproduce. So what are these gymnosperms? Well, gymnosperms belong to basically 4 extant classes. There were more classes of gymnosperms historically, but again, many of these gymnosperms didn't survive to current day, most notably a group called the seed ferns. The 4 classes of living gymnosperms are Conifers, Cycads, Gnetophytes, and Ginkgo. Let's talk about all of those individually. Of those 4, the conifers are the largest group by far. There's only about 1,000 gymnosperm species altogether, and there's about 650 conifer species. So these conifers represent the lion's share of all gymnosperms alive today. And that kind of makes sense. You're familiar with pines, spruces, cypress, all these trees that you see when you look around outside. You're probably less familiar with Gnetophytes, such as Weltwischia or ephedra or netum. You might be familiar with ginkgo, but there's only 1 species of ginkgo out there in the world, and you're probably only familiar with it because people like to plant it in cities. And then in terms of cycads, you might not see these anywhere unless you live kind of in the tropics or more somewhat tropical regions, in which case you might see some of them around. So since in general these gymnosperms are relatively rare, these conifers, which are less rare, represent 65% of all gymnosperm species, but something like 98% of all gymnosperm biomass. So even though there's a relatively small number of conifer species, they are so widely distributed, especially in the northern and southern latitudes and also on mountains where they've evolved to live, that there are a lot of individual trees around, and since trees are very big, they represent a whole lot of biomass. So 98% of all gymnosperm biomass are conifers. The other 2% is spread amongst all the other different types of gymnosperms, those 3 other classes. Conifers are typically trees. You can think of them as pine trees, spruce trees, fir trees. A lot of people tend to call all conifers pines, which I find really annoying because a pine is just one particular group of conifers. If the needles come in bundles, then it's a pine. Otherwise, it's probably some other type of conifer. So if you learn one thing from this video, it would be to look at a tree with needles and cones and say, that's a conifer, if you don't know exactly what species it is, instead of calling it a pine tree, because it might be a pine tree, but it's most likely not a pine tree. Conifers, as their name suggests, have cones. Now really, all gymnosperms have cones or cone-like things. We call these strobili, and they're the reproductive organs of gymnosperms. Since gymnosperms don't have flowers, they use these cone-like things to reproduce. Basically all gymnosperms have strobili. Only conifers have particularly woody female strobili that last a long time. And so that's what separates this group, the conifers, from all these other different type of gymnosperms. They're known for having these woody female cones. That's why we call them conifers, which means cone-bearing plants. Conifers are super cool. I'll probably make a whole video about them at some point. If you go hiking in the mountains, if you live in northern latitudes, you probably see these all over the place. And so you would be forgiven for believing that conifers are incredibly abundant all over the planet. The reality is they're not. They're especially evolved to live in these colder climates. When you get closer to the equator, angiosperms absolutely dominate. There's hardly ever a conifer to be found. And then maybe it's only up on the mountains or a highly specialized kind of weird conifer that doesn't have a huge distribution. Now, as I said earlier, most gymnosperms tend to be dioecious. They have separate male and female plants, and the pollen travels from a male plant to a female plant for fertilization. For conifers, this actually isn't the case. Conifers tend to have monoecious plants, which means that you often find the male pollen cones and the female cones on the same tree. This isn't true of every conifer species, but it's true of most conifers. The male cones are very small, they're very ephemeral, they disappear pretty quickly. They're made to release a whole lot of pollen really fast and then they fall apart and die, whereas the female cones tend to be larger, woody. You're familiar with what pine and fir cones look like. And they last a relatively long time. Their whole purpose is, at first when they're small, to collect the pollen, and then when they're fertilized, they grow the seeds, and then at some point when the seeds are mature and ready, and when the circumstances are right, the cones will open up and release the seeds. Again, these are gymnosperms, so the seeds aren't encased in a fruit, they're in a cone, and the cone, when it opens up, the seeds are just basically exposed to the world. Naked seed, gymnosperm. You get it. After the conifers, the next most populous group of gymnosperms are the cycads. Cycads have something about around 300 species. So again, not a whole lot, but again, these gymnosperms tend to be pretty rare. There aren't a whole lot of gymnosperm species out there. So the conifers had something like 600. The cycads are the next one up with something like 300 species. Cycads live mostly in the tropics and more tropical areas. And they look more or less like palm trees. The big difference is if you get up close and look at a palm, you would see, if it's during the flowering time of year, you would see flowers, and if it's during the fruiting time of years, you would see fruit, like dates, for example, are palm fruit. That's not true with cycads. If you look at cycads when they're producing pollen, you wouldn't see flowers, you would see strobili, cone-like things that produce the pollen. If you would look during the time of year when cycads are producing their seeds, again, you wouldn't see fruit because gymnosperms don't have fruit. You would just see female cones, female strobili that have seeds inside of them. Naked seeds, gymnosperms. Cycads are really neat for a lot of different reasons. They were very populous during the time of the dinosaurs. At one point, they were kind of the dominant plant on Earth, but they've since been outcompeted by all the different angiosperms out there. They're now very rare. Many of them are endemic to Africa. Some of them are so rare. My favorite example is a species called Encephalartos woodii. This species of cycad is so rare that people have only ever found male specimens. Now remember, gymnosperms are dioecious. That means they have both separate male and female plants. A lot of plants are monoecious, meaning they produce male cones and female cones on the same plant, but not most gymnosperms and not our cycads. So cycads produce female strobili on female plants and male strobili on male plants. The male strobili are small and they produce pollen. The female strobili are much bigger and they're made to contain the seeds, just like pine cones and stuff in our conifers. So if you have only male individuals, you can't sexually reproduce this species. And so people have only ever been able to reproduce this particular species, Encephalartos woodii, through cuttings and asexual propagation. So they just keep making clones of the same small group of male plants that they have, because they've never been able to find a female plant to reproduce those male plants with. It's very sad. If you know your Tolkien, it's exactly the story of the Entwives. The Ents are these kind of living trees, and they have lost their wives somewhere in Middle-earth. And because of this, because they have no wives, they can't reproduce. And so they're kind of slowly dying off. It's very sad, and it's true in this case as well. Another neat thing about cycads is cycads, like earlier plants, ferns and our other pteridophytes, our bryophytes, and even like algae, these cycads have swimming sperm. Now, unlike these other plants, they have pollen, just like most gymnosperms. So cycads produce pollen, and inside that pollen is actually a little swimming sperm. So when the cycad pollen leaves the male cone, the male strobilus, and it lands on a female strobilus, it actually lands on a drop of liquid called the pollination drop. And the pollen will then open up, release the swimming sperm, which will then swim to the egg and fertilize the egg, resulting in a seed in future generations of cycads. So their reproduction is this weird mix of earlier swimming sperm reproduction that we see in these plants that live in wet environments, algae, bryophytes, pteridophytes, and of having pollen, something that happens in these later plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms. So they're this really cool kind of missing link between these different groups of plants. Other gymnosperms and angiosperms, inside the pollen, there is a sperm, but it doesn't have a tail, it doesn't have a flagellum, it doesn't swim, it just kind of gets distributed to the egg through something called a pollen tube. We'll talk about that later. The last and perhaps most interesting fact about these cycads is gymnosperms, again, are generally wind pollinated. That's a big difference between these gymnosperms and earlier plants, pteridophytes, bryophytes, etc. Gymnosperms have pollen, and this pollen allows them to float their sperm in the breeze, send it far and wide, and then when it lands on a female cone, female strobilus, the pollen will open up and release the sperm inside the pollen, which will then fertilize the egg and result in seeds. So that means these gymnosperms are generally wind pollinated. That's actually not true of cycads. Cycads are the only gymnosperms that are animal pollinated. We think of angiosperms largely as being animal pollinated by bees, by flies, beetles, wasps, birds, bats, all kinds of stuff. In fact, many angiosperms are also wind pollinated, but many are animal pollinated. Our gymnosperms, they're almost all wind pollinated except for cycads. Cycads are actually pollinated by beetles, researchers have discovered recently. And that's because the strobili of the cycad, both the male and the female, release these kind of smells that attract beetles, and they also do thermogenesis. They kind of heat up to attract beetles towards them. So the beetles will actually get the pollen on them and take it from a male individual to a female individual. Again, these cycads are dioecious, from a male plant to a female plant. After the cycads are the Gnetophytes. Gnetophytes are a smaller class with less than 100 species split over 3 different genuses: Gnetum, Ephedra, and Weltwischia. Gnetophytes are kind of cool. Their cones look very flower-like, which is one of the reasons botanists for years thought these were actually flowering plants. They also do something called double fertilization, which I'll talk about when I talk about flowering plants. So they bear many superficial similarities to flowering plants. They even have things called vessel elements in their xylem and phloem that are more similar to flowering plants than gymnosperms. But they are very clearly gymnosperms. It's possible that they represent kind of the missing link between gymnosperms and flowering plants, and they're kind of they have shared a common ancestor with flowering plants more recently than any other type of gymnosperm, but the science is still out on that. No one knows for sure. The biggest genus in the Gnetophytes are Ephedra. Ephedra is found kind of across a temperate belt across North America and Asia. They tend to be in more dry regions. They're these kind of dry bushes, shrubs, and you might be familiar with the name ephedra because that's where the chemical compound ephedrine is synthesized from. Now, ephedrine is an upper, and it's very commonly abused. It was very commonly abused in diet pills and stuff back in the day. Definitely something to stay away from. But the more mild species of ephedra, people would kind of make tea out of and drink and get kind of a stimulant effect, very similar to having tea or coffee. After ephedra, the next most common genus in the Gnetophytes are Gnetum, where the Gnetophytes actually get their name from. Gnetum comes from a Malaysian word, and they're found mainly in the tropics. Again, they're kind of bushes, and they bear a very strong resemblance to angiosperms, but if you look closely, they don't have flowers, they have strobili, female strobili and male strobili. They have something like 30 to 40 species of Gnetum. Finally, the last genus in the Gnetophytes is Weltwischia. And Weltwischia is easy to do the species count. It has one species in that genus, also called Welwitschia. This is a plant found only in the Namib Desert. It's a weird, bizarre plant like no other plant on Earth, and botanists will kind of go on vacation just to Namibia just to get a look at one of these guys. One of the cool things about the Welwitschia plant is in the middle of the plant, it has these weird strobili, like so many other gymnosperms. And on the side of those strobili are two leaves. Welwitschia has two leaves for its whole life. That's all it produces. It's not like a tree that produces hundreds or thousands of leaves. It just produces two leaves. Now these leaves will kind of tear apart to look like many more kind of fronds, but it's just two leaves. And it kind of sprawls along the ground in the desert. Very alien looking plant. Super cool, a remnant from an earlier time, and the only species left of its genus in current day. Speaking of these survivor plants that only have one species in their genus, our final class of gymnosperms is Ginkgo. Now, Ginkgo, as a class, only contains one genus, and in that genus there's only one species, Ginkgo biloba, the ginkgo that you're familiar with. So if you see a ginkgo tree growing somewhere, you're looking at the only survivor of the entire ginkgo class. Now in the past, there were many different ginkgo trees, but again, like so many of these gymnosperms, they were outcompeted by angiosperms, and now there's only one species left to current day, which only survived basically in China, until people all over the world kind of found these trees, found that they looked really nice, they grow really well in cities, and so kind of grew them everywhere. Now about the ginkgo seeds, it kind of looks like a fruit. And so you would think, well, surely this is an angiosperm. There's this fruit-looking thing. Well, the seed isn't actually encased in a true fruit. There are some gymnosperms that kind of look like fruit, like the yew tree has a fruit-looking thing, junipers have a berry-looking thing, and ginkgos kind of look like a fruit as well. These are all examples of, I guess you would say, convergent evolution, something that's evolved to be like a fruit, but isn't exactly a fruit. Just like birds and bats have both evolved the ability to fly, although they've evolved it in different ways. In a ginkgo, it's actually just the integument or the seed coat that's kind of gotten thickened and kind of covers the seed in a very thick fruit-like layer. I know that seems like it is just semantics or whatever, but that actually is a big difference in terms of the evolutionary history and relatedness of this species, and that's why it's a gymnosperm and not an angiosperm. These are very cool looking, interesting, beautiful trees. They're widely used in herbalism and traditional Chinese medicine. And like so many of these gymnosperms, they're a last survivor of a once proud lineage and a living fossil. And I think that's just so cool and so interesting. And this is and I think that's why these ginkgo trees are so widely loved and prized and emblematic. So in the evolution of land plants, gymnosperms are one of the more recent types of plants. The most recent are angiosperms, but gymnosperms basically branched off from angiosperms somewhere about 125 million years ago. Gymnosperms evolved from basically ancient ferns, which developed the ability to produce seeds about 370 million years ago. They developed the ability to produce pollen around that exact same time. Now, to give you an idea of what the Earth would have looked like before gymnosperms, this was a time called the Carboniferous, and it would have been a time of massive ferns everywhere, massive club mosses that instead of being these short little plants you find by a stream bed, would have been these tall tree-like things. It would have been a really interesting landscape, and it would seem very alien to us today. There were, of course, bryophytes still living in the streams and swampy areas. In terms of animals, the Earth would have been covered in arthropods at this time. We saw that millipedes were one of the first animals to come on land, but then centipedes, insects, all kinds of other arthropods would come along. And in fact, the first tetrapods, that kind of fish thing that crawled onto the land, that happened almost around the exact same time we see the evolution of our first seed plants, these seed ferns that were ferns but produced seeds and had pollen. Now these seed ferns aren't around anymore, but they would eventually give way to our gymnosperms. So gymnosperms got their start somewhere around 370 million years ago with the evolution of seeds and pollen. And once gymnosperms kind of got their footing, they really took off. So we would see, around the time of the dinosaurs, we would see massive cycad forests everywhere. Now cycads are very rare today, but back then they were almost all over the wetter, equatorial, hotter parts of the planet. Likewise, there would have been ginkgos and other gymnosperm plants kind of everywhere. Now conifers, as we know them, they would become kind of focused on living in the mountains and these kind of areas where other plants didn't want to go, because that was a niche that was still ready to be explored. And in fact, that's where they still exist largely today, right? So gymnosperms, you can find them in the mountains and in the colder regions. They're really well adapted to surviving in that kind of environment. Now gymnosperms don't yet have flowers and fruit. Again, gymno means naked and sperm means seeds, so gymnosperms just means they have seeds, but it's not covered in a fruit. Whereas angiosperms, which would evolve a little bit later, 125 million years ago, those have flowers and fruit. Angio means vessel, sperm means seed, so they have their seed covered in a vessel, and that vessel is the fleshy ovary of the plant, which we call a fruit. So gymnosperms don't have fruit, they don't have flowers, but they do have seeds and pollen. Gymnosperms, for the most part, are masters of wind pollination, and they're the first plants that can really be successful at wind pollination. They don't need water to survive, and so once you see pollen evolve, you no longer need these like swimming sperm, because the pollen can get carried through the air from the male plant to the female plant, or the male part of the plant to the female part of the plant. So these gymnosperms don't need swimming sperm. Now, cycads and ginkgos actually still do have swimming sperm, because that represents kind of an evolutionary step between our ferns and our later plants, our gymnosperms and angiosperms. So that's actually pretty interesting about cycads and ginkgos. But our conifers and our gnetophytes don't have swimming sperm at all. They just have sperm that just sit there. Now, how do they get to the egg? We'll talk about that when we talk about gymnosperm reproduction later on in this video. You can watch my plant evolution video if you want more specifics on the evolution of plants, but know that there's basically three main trends. Plants become more terrestrial over time, and that's really important with gymnosperms, because gymnosperms are the first plants that have seeds, which are really good at surviving on land. They can survive in dry conditions, and pollen, which are made to be carried through the wind. So this represents a big step from water-based reproduction in our earlier plants to wind and animal-based reproduction in our later plants, our gymnosperms and angiosperms. So that's one way in which plants are getting better and better at surviving on land. The other big trend in plant evolution is our alternation of generations becomes less about the haploid gametophyte stage and more about the diploid sporophyte stage. And by the time we get to our gymnosperms, the plant is almost entirely sporophytes. So if you think of like a gymnosperm tree, like a fir tree, it's a sporophyte. It's just like us. It's diploid. It has two sets of chromosomes. It doesn't live part of its life as an organism with one set of chromosomes. It lives its entire life as an organism with two sets of chromosomes. The only time it's haploid at all is with its eggs and sperm, its pollen, and its female gametophyte, which is in the scale of the cone. And again, we'll talk about the alternation of generations for gymnosperms and also the reproduction of gymnosperms later on in this video. The final trend is diversity increases over time through evolution. And once these gymnosperms come on the scene, they add more diversity to the ferns and club mosses and bryophytes that were on Earth previously. And they get really good at surviving in all kinds of different places, including colder, drier areas like mountains. And when the Earth later on in its history gets a lot cooler, these gymnosperms are going to become really important, just like they are really important today in much of the planet, places where it's too cold, too dry for a lot of angiosperms. When I climb a mountain, for example, I get to a point where there are no angiosperm trees anymore. It's only gymnosperm trees. Now, as I said earlier, gymnosperms came on the scene around 370 million years ago. That was basically the time of the dinosaurs. So there were insects absolutely everywhere back then, and that would be important for things like cycads, which are pollinated by beetles. But also, this is the time, especially around 250 million years ago, when dinosaurs really began to take off. So dinosaurs lived in a world that was largely dominated by gymnosperms. There were obviously a lot of these ferns and club mosses still around, but the gymnosperms were really starting to take off during the time of the dinosaurs. Angiosperms wouldn't come around until the late Cretaceous, and so the dinosaurs were kind of almost on the way out by the time angiosperms finally came on the scene. Let's talk about the life cycle of gymnosperms. And every class of gymnosperms is a little bit different. A conifer is a little bit different from a cycad, which is different from a ginkgo. And even within a class, there's differences in the life cycle from one conifer to another, from a, let's say, a cedar to a spruce to a fir. But I'll just kind of give an overall, very general life cycle as best I can. I'll use the example of a conifer tree, like let's say a Douglas fir tree. And if you think of a tree, when it's all grown, this is a diploid tree. That's actually different from our bryophytes. Remember, if you saw my bryophytes video, a fully grown bryophyte, like a moss or a liverwort, is actually haploid. It only has one set of chromosomes. And that's the same with algae. So a fully grown alga is also haploid. It only has one set of chromosomes. But in our pteridophytes, and then everything after pteridophytes are gymnosperms and eventually our angiosperms, the fully grown plant is actually a sporophyte. It's a diploid individual. It has two sets of chromosomes. And so that's true of this Douglas fir tree. It's also true of you and I. We're also diploid. Okay, eventually as this tree grows up and gets older, eventually it'll reach a point of kind of sexual maturity. And at that point, it'll develop its cones. And really, that's kind of two types of cones. We've got a female cone, which is a little bit bigger there and is going to stick around for a while. And then, of course, our male cones, which are very short-lived and they fall apart, end up all over the ground. Maybe they end up on your car. They don't last very long. Their whole point is just to make pollen and then distribute it out into the wind. Now, as I discussed earlier, a lot of gymnosperms are actually dioecious. They have both male and female plants. That's not true for most of our conifers. Most of our conifers are monoecious. That means every plant has both male and female sex organs. So this Douglas fir tree produces female cones, but it also produces male cones. It's monoecious. Now, you would think that that's kind of a problem, right? Because what's the point of having both male and female reproductive organs? Because you're just going to end up reproducing with yourself. And then you might as well just make little clones. Like, why go through sexual reproduction at all? And that's very true. Although plants that are monoecious, that have both male and female sex organs on the same plant, they usually have many different barriers to fertilization. It could be that they release pollen a few weeks before the female cones are receptive. So when this tree is releasing its pollen, this female cone isn't receptive, but maybe a female cone on a different tree somewhere is. It could be that they have special chemical barriers to fertilization. So if a pollen grain ends up on this female cone and there's a chemical detection that it's from the same plant, it'll reject that pollen grain. That's more advanced. You see that more in angiosperms. Or in this case, there's actually a pretty simple way of doing it, and that is the pollen cones are down low on the tree. And I see this on the trees in my neighborhood and in nature when I walk around. And the female cones are up high in the tree. And so that means when this cone drops pollen, it's not going to fertilize that cone up there. Even if it gets blown away by the wind and the pollen gets blown up high, it's still not going to fertilize this cone in this tree. It's going to get blown up and hit a different pollen cone in a different tree. So having the male cones lower than the female cones is another cool way to prevent self-fertilization, which no plant really wants to do because they could just reproduce asexually if they were going to just end up having sex with themselves to produce seeds. It doesn't really make sense. Okay, I'm going to zoom in on these cones so we can see them a little better now. So let's, okay, if we were to zoom in on this male pollen cone, it might look something like that if you zoom in really close. And on each of these kind of wings of the cone, we would find what's called the microsporocyte. Okay, here's my male pollen cone, and this is sometimes referred to as the microstrobilus. Remember, all reproductive structures of gymnosperms are called strobili. And with conifers, we tend to call the strobili cones, but they're still strobili. All cones are strobili, but not all strobili are cones, right? So this male pollen cone is a strobilus and this female cone is a strobilus. Now we call it a microstrobilus because male pollen cones are smaller and they tend to make male gametes, which are smaller than female gametes. Okay, on each of the wings of this male pollen cone, or microstrobilus, each of these we would call a microsporangia. A little bit of etymology here. If we look at this word microsporocyte, we can see that cyte means cell, sporo means spore, and micro means small, or in this case, male, because remember, male gametes are small. Sperm are small, eggs are big. So these are cells that produce microspores, which are eventually going to be our male gametes. Okay, and so within these microsporangia, we have these particular cells called microsporocytes. And you know, this is part of the conifer tree, so these microsporocytes are diploid. But they're going to produce gametes, which are haploid. Now, if you're familiar with biology, whenever you produce gametes, you always go through the process of meiosis, which is a process where we take two end cells and we produce haploid end cells. Okay, so those microsporocytes are going to go through the process of meiosis and they're going to produce these haploid cells. That's the sperm, right? Well, actually, no. We've got a ways to go until we get to the sperm. Each microsporocyte is going to produce 4 of these haploid cells, which we're going to call microspores. Here's the point where if you're kind of a logical person, you might have a red flag and you might say, okay, one of these cells produces 4 of those cells. That actually doesn't really make sense because a diploid cell has 2 sets of chromosomes, right? So if you split it apart into haploid cells, you should have 2 haploid cells, not 4 haploid cells. But you might recall that the process of meiosis, before the division happens, there's actually a period of mitosis. So we start with a diploid cell, 2 sets of chromosomes. It doubles into 2 diploid cells. Now we have 2 cells, each with 2 sets of chromosomes. And then those split apart into our 4 haploid cells. So that's what's going on here. Now these microspores are going to mature. They're going to go through the process of mitosis, where a cell copies itself. And they're going to form these kind of clusters of cells that are they have a tough kind of coat on the outside called sporopollenin. Sometimes they have air sacs that help them kind of float through the air. And they also have like a cell in the middle that's going to become something important later on. What we're looking at here is pollen, which is a collection of haploid cells that's very tough, that's made to float through the air, that resists drying out, and inside of that are the cells that will eventually divide into sperm, which will, aid in the reproduction of the species. So again, once again, pollen isn't plant sperm. It's actually the male gametophyte, because it produces the male gametes. Inside this pollen, the sperm will be formed. So a lot of pollen floating around in the air doesn't even have plant sperm in it. It has cells that will eventually produce the plant sperm. So sperm's not quite the right analogy for what a pollen is. It's more like if like human testicles like floated around the air and were super tough and resistant to drying out, and then once they land, then they produce the sperm. That would be more like a pollen grain. That was a little weird to say, but there you go. Okay, let's stop here and look at what's going on with those crazy female cones. So again, these male cones, they're very short-lived. They tend to be on the bottom of trees, although sometimes they can be higher up in the trees. It just depends on the particular tree. If you hit them or the wind blows them, they release all kinds of pollen. That's their whole raison d'etre. That's their whole point in existing, is to make a bunch of pollen and then die and fall off and be gone. Female cones stick around. So a young, immature female cone kind of just looks like a small cone that you're used to, like a pine cone or a fir cone or a spruce cone or something like that. It's just they're smaller and they're greener. In these Douglas fir trees, they look kind of like hairy almost. They're very cool looking. They're these kind of frilly looking green cones, and they're high up in the tree. Okay, and they are going to produce the female gametes. If we look at that female cone, it's made of these kind of big scales, a bunch of these little scales. If you looked at a pine cone, you can tell those little scales. And at the base of those scales, there's usually an opening, a very small little opening. That's called the micropyle. Small opening. The kind of like skin of the female cone is called the integument. There's a chamber inside the cone, and this is called the ovule. And inside that ovule, there's a little diploid cell called the megasporocyte. And once again, cyte means cell, sporo means spore, and mega means big. So this is just a cell that's going to produce megaspores. Remember, our microsporocytes produced microspores, which eventually became male gametes. Megasporocytes going to produce megaspores, which are going to become female gametes. And unlike with our microsporocytes, our pollen cones, the male part of the plant, the female part isn't going to release these cells into the air as pollen, right? The ovule is going to stay where it is, and the microsporocyte is going to stay within the ovule, within that cone. So as you can see, I redrew my structure here to better fit my screen. It was getting a little bit unwieldy, but we were focusing on the female cone. And in the female cone, we have this thing called the megasporocyte. Again, mega means big, sporo means spore, and cyte means cell. So this is the big spore-producing cell. Just like we have microsporocytes in our male pollen cones. So the microsporocytes went through meiosis and produced these things called microspores, which matured into our pollen, which is just the male gametophyte. And of course, these are all haploid. Anything coming out of meiosis is haploid. We now have our megasporocyte also going through meiosis, producing a haploid cell. Now, if a microsporocyte produced microspores, a megasporocyte is going to produce what now? Yep, you got it, megaspores. And so, unlike on the pollen cone, where the pollen is shed and released into the air, the megasporocyte has to stay exactly where it is in this little scale on the seed cone. So let's redraw the scale now. And inside of that ovule, we have our megasporocyte. It's now got 4 little microspores that developed via meiosis. Now in the pollen grain, all 4 of those microspores are going to mature into the pollen. With our megaspores, basically only one of them is going to make it, the other 3 are going to get absorbed. And so now, in the scale of our cone, we still have that ovule, and in that ovule we have the one remaining megaspore, which matures into the female Gnetophyte. Okay, and this female Gnetophyte is the cells are gonna continue to divide through the process of mitosis. It'll form 2 little chambers, the archegonia, and in those archegonia will form the eggs. One other thing will happen, and that is on this female Gnetophyte, often it'll form a little drop of water here in the opening. Remember, this opening is called the micropyle, and we call this the pollination drop. It's not present in every Gymnosperm species, but I'll include it here. Okay, so our pollen now is ready. So the pollen has gone through a period of maturity, and it's now time for the pollen to land on this female Gnetophyte. Our male and female Gnetophytes have finally come together. And it'll land right there on that pollination drop. Now, remember, the pollen grain isn't plant sperm. I really want you to take that away from this video. Everyone thinks pollen is plant sperm. Pollen is kind of like, it's more like a plant testicle than a plant sperm. It will eventually produce sperm, but it isn't itself sperm. So now that our pollen has landed on our female cone in this particular spot called the pollination drop at the opening of this ovule called the micropyle, now finally the pollen can start to produce sperm, and it'll go through the process of mitosis and divide these haploid end cells into sperm. So let's give it a little bit more time now. And this will blow your mind. So now that the pollen has landed on the female cone, how long is it going to take fertilization to occur? A few seconds, a few minutes, a few hours? It's going to take anywhere between a year to 2 years, a massive amount of time, so that this whole reproductive cycle from basically producing our sperm and eggs, producing our male and female cones, eventually getting sperm and eggs, getting fertilization, and getting to a seed. This could take somewhere in the order of 3 years for many conifer species, anywhere between 1 to 3 years. That's kind of crazy, right? Like in humans, we know as soon as the sperm gets the egg, it's fertilization. It happens very quickly after the act of intercourse. In flowering plants, the pollen will basically land on the female structure called the style, and then it'll produce a pollen tube, it'll go down and fertilize the egg and start to form a seed. This can take a few hours. So gymnosperms in this respect take forever. They have a really, really slow reproductive process, which again kind of goes along with gymnosperms and especially conifers in general. They move slowly, that's why some of them are the oldest plants on Earth. They're more built for survival on a much longer time frame than we tend to think. And so just like with all other things, conifers do things on their own darn time. So this process of fertilization, now that the sperm has landed, the pollen has landed on the female Gnetophyte, can take somewhere up to 2 years. Okay, so what does that look like? Well, again, cycads have swimming sperm. So if this were a cycad, this pollen would start producing swimming sperm. They would have little tails and they would swim through the pollination drop into the ovule, into the archegonia, and fertilize the egg. But this isn't a cycad, this is a conifer. And conifers have pollination tubes, a different form of reproduction from any of our earlier plants. Remember, all of our earlier plants, bryophytes, pteridophytes, even our earlier, supposedly earlier gymnosperms like cycads and ginkgo have swimming sperm. Our later plants, conifers and angiosperms, have this pollination tube thing. Their sperm just look like cells without little flagella on them. They're just more or less stationary cells. But what's going to happen is, so here is our female gametophyte, here are our archegonia, and in there we've got our eggs. This pollen, when it lands there, is going to produce this long tube that's slowly going to grow until it punches into the ovule, into the archegonia. And then our sperm cells, which is now kind of matured. Again, remember, the sperm isn't in the pollen when it's on the tree or even when it's flying around. Once the pollen lands on the pollination drop, then it begins the process of making sperm. Then it will take those sperm, move it through this pollination tube, and then eventually dump it right there on the egg where it can connect with the egg and fertilization can happen. Yay, we got to fertilization. And I'll label that pollination tube. Pollination tubes are extremely common in most plants because remember, most plants are angiosperms, flowering plants, and flowering plants have pollination tubes. So do many of our gymnosperms, our conifers, and our gnetophytes. Okay, so now that our pollination tube, it's just one, sorry, has made it so that the sperm can travel down the tube and connect with the egg, we now have a haploid cell, the sperm, and a haploid cell, the egg, coming together to make a diploid cell, which we call a zygote. Just like with animals and all other kinds of fertilization. Once that fertilization happens, remember this outer skin here around the scale is called the integument. It's basically going to seal up. The cells here are going to grow until that micropyle, the little space in the integument where the sperm can go through, where the pollination drop is, that micropyle now is sealed up. It disappears. And inside that now sealed up scale, we have our first diploid cell. It's 2N, right there. We call that the zygote. And that zygote will go through the process of mitosis, reproducing itself, reproducing itself, reproducing itself, until it becomes a much bigger cluster of cells that kind of looks like this. And we call that the embryo. Again, this mirrors reproduction in so many things, including humans. Okay, now, is that embryo haploid or diploid? Of course it's diploid, right? Everything from the zygote on is now diploid, because if you have a diploid cell and it reproduces to make a bunch of other cells, they're also going to be diploid. The integument surrounding the embryo is also diploid, because it was originally just part of the tree, so it's also diploid. But now that that integument has kind of sealed up the micropyle and starting to thicken up, we don't call it an integument anymore, we call it a seed coat. And it will thicken up to kind of protect what's now becoming a seed. This is just a seed at this point. Now the seed coat is also diploid, but these little cells surrounding the embryo, this is an empty space here, this is all kind of tissue. These were just made from basically this archegonia tissue that wasn't fertilized. And we know that our female gametophyte and our archegonia, those are all haploid. So this tissue in here is haploid. It only has one set of chromosomes. And this is basically food for the developing embryo. Because remember, seeds are these cool survival mechanisms. They're not plant babies, they're special space shuttles for plant babies that protect the embryo, right? We have this seed coat now that is thick and will protect the embryo against drying out, against just falling apart or being destroyed easily. That'll nourish the developing embryo. We have all this food here that the embryo will eat as it continues to grow and will allow it to survive on its own for months or years if it has to wait until conditions are just right for germination and to grow into a new plant. And then finally, the plant baby is inside the little space shuttle, and this is our embryo right here, just waiting to grow into a new Douglas fir tree. And when conditions are right, it's wet enough, it's warm enough, there's enough light, whatever conditions Douglas firs need for germination, it will begin to do just that and then grow into the tree. And then years from then, when the tree gets big enough and sexually matures, it'll start the process all over again. If you made it this far, thanks for learning with me about these amazing plants, these gymnosperms that cover the northern hemisphere where I live. Whenever I climb mountains, they're the dominant tree up there. They're large, they're beautiful, they're almost mystical when you see a really huge one like a sequoia or a redwood. Even though they're very old, they're still kicking along today, just like crocodiles and mosses and ferns and algae. And so next time you go hiking in the woods and you see these absolute stalwart trees that have survived for so long, that are absolute masters of wind pollination, that totally conquered the time of the dinosaurs and still have conquered the more extreme environments here on Earth, the northern latitudes, the mountains, the deserts. Take a moment and just appreciate them for what they are, these relics of evolution that have a body plan that still works effectively to this day, and in some ways is better than their more recent cousins, the angiosperms. As always, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.